sold for cattle at the trading post in front of the town. A cowboy outbid them all and made her free. The coin was warm from my pocket when I set it on the counter. Not a stack of them. One, a silver dollar with a dent on the eagle's wing where some drunk had bitten it in a card game 3 years back and decided it was real. I'd won it off him before he figured out I wasn't going to argue the point. That coin had been in my breast pocket through 2 winters, a river crossing that nearly killed my horse, and a stretch in Colinas County I don't talk about. I kept it because it was the last thing I owned that felt like luck. I set it on Harlan Prute's counter, and I said, "I want to know what that woman owes you." He looked at me the way men look at a stranger when they're trying to decide if he's foolish or dangerous. I was neither. I was just a man who'd ridden into Garnet Flats 2 days before on a horse that needed shoes and hadn't yet found a reason to leave. The reason was standing in the yard behind the trading post with her wrists in a loose wrap of rope, not tied hard, more like the men holding it assumed she wouldn't run. She hadn't run. She was standing straight, hands at her waist, looking at the middle distance the way women do when they've decided that whatever is happening is not going to break them, and the only question is whether the men around them deserve to witness that. I'd seen her from the road. I was leading Cobb by the bridle because his left rear shoe had thrown a nail somewhere back on the flats, and I wasn't going to push him on Caliche Rock. The yard was off the main trace, behind the post, which was a low adobe building painted the color of old bone. There were 4 men there, and she was among them. No one was touching her. But the posture of the men, the particular way grown men arrange themselves around a woman who is being held, told me what I needed to know before anyone opened their mouth. I didn't stop. I led Cobb to the rail, tied him, went inside. Harlan Prute was the kind of man who comes standard in a town that size, not wicked, exactly, but comfortable with situations that would make a better man's stomach turn, as long as there was some paper attached to justify it. He had a ledger on the counter, and he was polishing a glass that didn't need polishing, which is what men do when they're waiting to see if someone will object. I set the coin down. He looked at it, he looked at me. I said, "The woman in the yard, what's she owe you?" He said she didn't owe him anything. She was the widow of a man named Caleb Drum, who had owed Tanner Foss $72 against a crop advance from the spring. Caleb Drum had died in July. A horse rolled on him in a ravine. Nobody saw it happen, which I noted without saying anything. Foss held the note. There was nothing on the land worth $72 according to Foss's man, a pale fellow named Birch who had a way of arriving at convenient numbers. So Foss had called the debt against Drum's estate, which in practical terms meant against Drum's wife, since the law out here was roughly what the man with the most paper said it was. The trading post was the debt collection point, which meant Foss was, in some arrangement I didn't need spelled out, going to take the woman herself as settlement. I said, "How long has she been in that yard?" Prute said since morning. He used the word auction. He said it like a man who has talked himself into a word and knows it's wrong and uses it anyway because he's already signed the paper. The auction was that afternoon. I said, "The debt is $72. He said that was the base, yes, that there might be additional fees. He said additional fees with the glass still rotating in his hand. I said, "What time this afternoon?" He told me 2 o'clock. I looked at the clock on the wall behind him, which had a crack in its face but was running. It was 11:15. I walked out. Now I should tell you a few things about who I was at that point, because they matter. My name is Deke Collard. I was 51 years old that fall, which in some lights is a young man, and in others is a man who has used up several of his better arguments with the world. I had spent the previous 8 years working other men's cattle across most of the Texas Panhandle and the eastern strip of New Mexico territory, which sounds like a long career and is instead a long habit. I was not broke. I was not rich. I was the particular kind of man who stays financially even because he has trained himself to want very little, which is either wisdom or damage. I have never fully decided. I had no wife. I had had a long time back, something close to a woman I might have asked, but I had been on the trail and she had not waited, and I had decided, somewhere around year 3 of being angry about it, that being angry about it was too expensive and I was going to just ride. So I rode. I was good with cattle. I was good with horses. I was good at reading a situation before the situation read me, which is the one skill that had kept me alive longer than skill with a gun, though I had that too. I had come to Garnet Flats because the man I'd been working for, a rancher named Connolly, had sold out to a land company from back east, and I was owed 38 days of wages, and the company's representative had offered me $22 and an attitude. I had taken the $22 and the attitude had not worked out well for either of us, though I'd stopped short of anything permanent. I was moving on. Garnet Flats was between me and Tucson, and Cobb needed a shoe. I had $104 in my saddlebag. This is a thing I need you to know. I found the livery and paid for Cobb's shoe. The smith was a quiet man named Aldous with 2 missing fingers on his left hand who worked without talking, which I appreciated. While he worked, I leaned against the post and watched the street. Garnet Flats was a town trying to decide if it was going to survive. You could see it in the buildings, some of them good adobe, solid, with real glass in the windows, some of them raw lumber already going gray and soft at the sills. The street had been graded at some point, but the summer rains had put the ruts back. There was a general store, a saloon, the trading post, a church that looked like it was used for storage, and a scattering of houses back from the road. Maybe 200 people, maybe less. The kind of town where a man like Tanner Foss could exist, which is to say a man who had arrived with capital before anyone else, and had turned that small advantage into a permanent one by being willing to file paper on people when they were weakest. I'd known towns like it. I'd known men like Foss without knowing Foss specifically. You don't need to meet the particular wolf to know the shape of the tracks. Aldous finished the shoe and took my money, and I led Cobb back to the post rail and sat on the step outside Prute's place and took out my knife and cleaned my nails and waited. At noon, people started drifting. Not a crowd adrift, 6, 8 men. A couple of women who stood at a distance with the particular angle of someone who is present, but wishes to establish that they are not participating. 3 men from the saloon who came because something was happening, and something happening was better than nothing. A boy of about 12 sitting on the top rail of the yard fence. Tanner Foss arrived at noon. He was not what I'd expected, which is a thing that happens to me less than it used to. I had expected fat and loud. He was lean, about 40, with a good hat and clean boots, and he moved through the yard with the ease of a man who never hurries because nothing has ever required it. He had 2 men with him, Birch, who I recognized from Prute's description, and another man who was wide through the shoulders and wore his gun on the left side, which either means he's left-handed or he wants you to wonder about it. The woman, I still didn't know her name, was still in the yard. She had not sat down. 4 hours in that yard and she had not sat down. There was a barrel behind her and a stump and she hadn't used either. She was still standing. She had dark hair pinned up, but some of it had come loose in the wind and she hadn't fixed it. Her dress was plain cotton, brown and worn at the cuffs. She was maybe 40, maybe less, hard to judge on a woman who has been working land in that country, which ages a face without aging the eyes. Her eyes were dark and level, and they found Foss when he came in and stayed on him the way a hawk stays on something, not moving, just watching to see what it does next. I stood up from the step and moved to the edge of the yard. Foss spoke first to Prute, not to her. He confirmed the amount, the terms, the arrangement. Prute had a paper and read from it in the flat voice of a man who is reading and not listening to what he reads. The debt was $72. The interest was $9. The collection fee was $11. I did the arithmetic without moving my lips. Foss looked at the woman. He said something to her I couldn't hear from where I stood. She said something back. Whatever it was, Birch laughed and the wide man did not, which told me the wide man was smarter than he looked. Then Prute called it open. Foss bid $50. He said it the way you say something when you have already decided the outcome and you are performing the steps because the steps are what make the paper legal. I said $92. The yard went quiet the way a yard full of people goes quiet, which is not silent but is held. Foss turned. He looked at me the same way Prute had, only Prute had been trying to categorize me and Foss was doing something else. Foss was calculating. He said, "That's a stranger." I said, "I got here Tuesday. That qualifies." One of the women at the far edge of the yard made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Foss said pleasantly that the bid didn't end anything, that he intended to settle the debt in full plus a fair consideration for the widow's use of his man's time in administering the estate. I said, "What's the number?" He said 110. I said 120. He looked at me for 3 full seconds without saying anything. That is a long time for a man like Foss to go without saying anything. Then he named 140. I had $104. I said 155. That was a lie. It was also a bet. The bet was that Foss wanted to win the paper more than he wanted the particular woman, and that the number had a ceiling for him, and that ceiling was somewhere between 140 and whatever I was willing to say out loud. He said, "You don't have that." I said, "You don't know what I have." Which was true, he didn't. He looked at me another moment. He looked at Birch. He looked at the woman who was watching all of this with her hands still at her waist and her face giving nothing away. He said 160. Now I was truly past my means. I had $51 available beyond what I'd said, which would get me to 155 actual and not a cent more, and I had already used 155. The yard was watching me. I said $200. Foss said nothing. I kept my face arranged the way I'd learned to keep it, which is the way a man's face looks when he has laid down something he is prepared to lose. I have won exactly 3 hands of cards in my life purely on that face, and I needed it to work once more. Foss said, "You don't have $200. I said, "Then match it and find out." What I was counting on was this. Foss was a man who managed his reputation before he managed his money. The town was watching. If he matched me and I couldn't pay, he got the woman and I looked like a fool, but I also looked like a man who had tried, and Foss would look like the man who had enforced it. If Foss backed down, even to avoid a bluff, he was the man who had blinked in front of his own town. Men like Foss can absorb losing money. They cannot absorb looking like they flinched. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Fine, the note's settled, she walks, and you." He put something into that last word that I understood was not finished, but that was a later problem. Prout took the number down. I walked to Prout's counter and I counted out my actual $104, and I told Prout I would have the remainder within 3 days or he could come find me. Prout looked at the money and looked at me and looked at Foss, who had already turned and was walking back toward the street with his men, and Prout decided the 104 was enough to settle it, which was the smartest thing he'd done all day. I went into the yard. She was still standing where she'd been standing. She watched me come, and she did not step back, and she did not step forward, and she did not say thank you, which is the thing I remember best about that moment. Not that she was ungrateful, she was something else. She was a woman making a decision, and she was making it while looking at me, and the decision was, who is this man and what does he want? I said, "My name is Deke Collard. I'm passing through toward Tucson." She said, "Nora Drum." She said it the way a person states the one thing that remains theirs. I said, "Mrs. Drum, you owe me $92, which I don't need from you. But Foss is going to come back at your land once I'm gone, and I want you to know that before I ride out." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "I know he will." I said, "All right." That was the whole conversation. I walked to Cobb and checked the new shoe with my thumb, and the farrier had done good work. I stood there for a minute with my hand on Cobb's neck, thinking about Tucson, which was where I was headed and had a reason to be. Then I tied off and went to see if the saloon had coffee. The coffee was bad, which I had expected. The saloon was dim and smelled of sawdust and old tobacco. The barman, a round man named Cleet, set the cup down and didn't charge me for it, which was either hospitality or the local way of establishing they'd been watching from inside, too. I drank the coffee standing at the end of the bar and thought about what I'd done and what it had cost me, and what I was going to do about the fact that I had less than $5 actual cash and still needed to reach Tucson. I wasn't worried exactly. I'd been shorter before, but I was calculating. Birch came in about 40 minutes later. He didn't come to talk to me. He went to the far end of the bar and ordered whiskey and stood there drinking it slowly and looking at the mirror behind the bottles, which means he was looking at me. I kept my back to him and finished my coffee and set the cup down and said to Cleet, "He been here before." Cleet said once or twice, "He's Foss's man." I said, "I know that. Does he come in to deliver messages or to start things?" Cleet thought about this honestly, which I appreciated. He said, "Mostly messages." I turned around. Birch was watching me through the mirror. When I turned, he turned too, a slow pivot, the unhurried move of a man who has been told to look confident. He said, Mr. Foss would like to speak with you. I said, I'm here. He said Mr. Foss would prefer somewhere private. I said, tell him I'll be at the livery in an hour. He can come or not. Birch processed that and left. I ordered another coffee and Cleet gave it to me free again, and I sat on a stool for a while and thought about the woman in the yard. Nora Drum. Caleb Drum, who had died in a ravine and nobody saw it, which was the kind of fact that sits in a room and doesn't leave. I wasn't a lawman. I wasn't her family. I wasn't anything to her except a stranger who had put money I didn't exactly have between her and a man who meant her harm. I had done what I had done for the same reason I had always done things. Not because there was a reward in it, but because I had been in that yard and the thing was happening, and I was the only person standing there who had both the will and the approximate means to stop it. Which is not heroism, it is just arithmetic. I went to the livery. Foss came alone, which told me something. He came without Birch and without the wide man, and he came in through the livery door and stood with his good hat in his hand, which told me something else. A man with his hat in his hand has decided to negotiate. He said, you played that smart. I said, I played it honest. I didn't have the money. He said he knew that. I said, then you knew it and you still let her walk. He looked at me steadily. He said, there are easier ways to settle a debt than making enemies of passing strangers. I said, that's true. He said he was prepared to call the whole thing finished. I had paid the note. She was free. He would write off the remainder as a loss to the estate of Caleb Drum, who he said, and here his voice shifted just slightly, had not been well liked even before the business with the ravine. I listened to that without commenting. He said he hoped I would be on my way by morning. I said I was planning on it. He put his hat back on and walked out, and I stood in the livery with the smell of horses and fresh straw, and I listened to his boots on the hardpack until they faded. Then I stood there a while longer. I should tell you I went back to the post and asked Pruitt if there was a room. He had one, a back room with a cot and a window the size of a Bible, and I took it for 2 nights, which used up another $1.20. Then I sat on the cot and took my boots off and looked at the ceiling and thought about Tucson and about what Foss had said about Caleb Drum. Not well liked before the business with the ravine. Caleb Drum had died in July. The crop advance was from spring. So Foss had lent money to a man in spring, that man had died in a ravine in summer, and by fall Foss was holding his widow in a yard. I am not a man who looks for trouble. I have in my life covered approximately 12,000 miles on horseback specifically to avoid trouble. I have a very good sense for when I am in trouble's territory, and that sense was telling me now that I was standing square in the middle of it, and had been since I set my coin on Pruitt's counter. I put my boots back on. Nora Drum's land was 3 miles south on a dirt track that Pruitt described by landmarks, big creosote, the dry wash, a gate made of 2 fence posts, and a wire that was missing the wire. I found it at dusk, which was orange and flat and made everything look either beautiful or on fire. The house was small adobe with a brush ramada on the south side. There was a kitchen garden still growing on the east, leggy tomatoes and some squash, the kind of garden that a person maintains when they are determined to still be there to harvest it. A hen with 2 chicks moved slowly along the base of the garden wall. There was a lamp on inside, low. I stopped Cobb at the track and didn't ride in. I called her name. She came to the door. She looked at me across the yard without surprise, not like she'd expected me, but like a woman who has been waiting for trouble to make its next appearance and has accepted that it will arrive in various forms. She said, Mr. Collard. I said, I want to tell you a few things. I'll stand here if you prefer. She looked at me a moment and then she said, come in and eat something. The inside of the house was clean. That is the first thing I noticed, not clean the way a house is when you're expecting guests, but the settled clean of a person who has been keeping order in a small space for a long time. There were 2 chairs and a table and a shelf of books. The books stopped me. Not many, 7, 8, but they were there and they were organized. She put coffee on and set bread and beans in front of me and sat across the table, and I told her what I'd seen and heard and what I suspected about her husband. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence in which she poured coffee and set the pot down carefully and looked at the table and said, I know. I said, you know what Foss did. She said, I don't know it the way a court would need it. I know it the way a woman knows when a man's death was convenient for someone else. I said, have you told anyone? She said, who would I tell? Which was the right answer for a town like Garnet Flats. We sat with that for a moment. I said, what are you going to do? She said, stay, this is my land. My husband filed it and I'll hold it. I'm not going anywhere because Tanner Foss finds it convenient. I looked at her when she said that. The lamp was behind her and there was a moth working at the chimney glass and the room smelled of beans and wood smoke and something dried hanging from the Ramada rafters, lavender or sage. I couldn't tell. She had her hands on the table and she was looking at me with no particular softness and no particular hardness, just that level watching, and I thought, this is a woman who has decided what she is and doesn't need anyone to tell her. I said I was headed for Tucson. She said, I didn't ask you to stay. I said, no, you didn't. She said, but I wouldn't send you away if you wanted to look at the land. I said, all right. I slept in the barn. This is important. She offered me the main room, she would take the back, and I said I was fine in the barn, which I was. I have slept in barns my whole life, and there is nothing wrong with a barn. Cobb was there, and he was settled, and I lay in the hay in my bedroll and looked at the barn roof with its 3 missing boards that let in stars, and I listened to the desert quiet, which is not as quiet as people think. In the morning I was up before she was. I checked the water situation first because that is always first in that country. There was a well in the yard, hand-dug, maybe 30 feet, lined with flat rock, and when I drew it up it was good, clear water with a cold weight to it that meant a real source. The rope was fraying. I made a note. Then I walked the land. She had 60 acres filed, which in that soil and that climate could be worked if you had water and the patience of a stone. The north field had been put in Milo in the spring. It was harvested, not well, the stalks cut at the wrong height by a man who'd probably been sick by then. The south field was fallow and weedy. There was a small peach orchard, 6 trees, 3 of them with fruit still on. Something had been at the peaches. I read the tracks as javelina. I walked back to the house. She was in the garden with a hoe. She didn't look up when I came near. She said, what do you see? I said, 60 acres of possible. Water's good. The well rope needs replacing. The south field could winter wheat if you got it in before the end of the month. She stopped hoeing and leaned on the handle and looked at me. She said, you know farming. I said, I know enough. She went back to hoeing and said, the Milo paid half of what Caleb said it would. He borrowed against the other half, which is how we ended up with Foss. I said, I know. She said, he wasn't a bad man. He was just hopeful, the wrong kind of hopeful. He believed the numbers he wanted to believe. I said, a lot of men do. She said, do you? I said, no, I believe the numbers that are there. She looked at me again with that same level watching and said, that's either useful or lonely. I said, both, mostly. She almost smiled. Almost. It came and went like the shadow of a cloud crossing flat ground. I didn't leave that day. I want to be honest about why, and honesty requires saying that I'm not entirely sure. Part of it was practical. I had almost no cash and Tucson would still be there. Part of it was the land, which was genuinely workable if someone worked it. Part of it was what Foss had said, and what I knew about the ravine, which put me in a position I've always found uncomfortable, knowing something that no one has done anything about yet. And part of it, and I'm saying this to you now because you deserve the honest version, part of it was just her. Not in the way you might think, or maybe in exactly that way, I don't know. I am 51 years old and I have been on a horse more or less continuously for 30 years, and I have met women I admired, and women I desired, and occasionally women I respected, and they are not always the same woman. Nora Drum was the last kind in a way I hadn't encountered much, which is the kind of woman who has been through the fire and come out the other side without the fire having burned away what made her worth knowing. I didn't say any of that. I wasn't going to say any of that. I fixed the well rope. On the 3rd day, Foss sent Birch. I was on the roof of the house. There were 3 cracked adobes on the north slope that were going to let in water when the rains came again, and I saw him coming down the track. He came the same way he'd come everywhere, as if he owned the air he walked through, which was a kind of style I had once found irritating and now found instructive. Nora was inside. I came down off the roof. Birch stopped at the yard edge. He looked at me, and then he looked at the house, and then back at me. He said, "You're still here." I said, "Apparently." He said Foss wanted me to understand that my presence complicated things. I said, "What things?" He said the situation regarding the property. I said, "The property that was filed by Caleb Drum and is legally held by his widow." He said, "Yes, that property." I said, "It's not complicated. She holds the land. I'm doing repairs. That's the whole of it." He said Foss was willing to make her a fair offer for the land, given the difficulty of a single woman managing it alone. I said, "She's not alone." That wasn't something I'd planned to say. It came out the way true things sometimes come out ahead of the thought. Birch looked at me carefully. He said he'd pass that along. He rode back down the track. I stood in the yard for a minute. The hens were moving near the garden wall. One of the peach trees was dropping the last of its fruit. I could hear them hitting the ground on the far side of the orchard, small, soft impacts. One, and then another. Nora came out of the house. She said, "I heard that." I said, "I know." She said, "The last part." I said, "I know." She stood on the step and looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. Then she said, "Come in and wash up. I made something." There is a particular thing about sitting at someone's table night after night in a small house. Something that happens over time that has nothing to do with how you feel about the person or what you've said to them. The house starts to know you're there. The lamp seems to be lit for you as much as for them. The sounds, the chair scraping, the dishes moving, the small settling of an adobe house at night, start to sound familiar in a way that is separate from any decision you've made. I noticed this on about the 7th day. I had fixed the roof. I had replaced the well rope. I had pulled the weeds from the south field and turned it. I had shot a javelina that was working through the peach orchard at 3 in the morning and hung it from the Ramada post and dressed it before breakfast, which she had watched through the window and then come out and said, "Thank you." Which was the first time she'd said those words to me, and she said them without sentimentality, which is the only way they mean anything. The winter wheat seed I had found at Prute's, paid for on account, which Prute had extended with a sort of resigned grace that suggested he had decided I was going to be present in his affairs for a while. The seed was in the ground in the south field now, under a sky that was shifting from the white heat of late October toward something cooler. The smell of the turned earth had been in the air all week. It is one of the best smells there is. Foss had not come himself. Birch had come once more with a written offer. I had taken the paper from him and handed it to Nora, and she had read it and set it on the table and not answered it. Birch had gone. The paper was still on the table, folded. On the 7th night I was sharpening my knife on the step after supper, and she came and sat on the step beside me, not saying anything. The desert at that hour, a clear, cold November night, stars out from horizon to horizon, makes a sound that is partly the wind and partly something else, some frequency you feel more than here. Coyotes somewhere to the east, a long way off. She said, "Tell me about Tucson." I said, "I know a man there who owes me work. Had a letter from him in the spring. Thought maybe there was a reason to go." She said, "Was there?" I said, "There was a reason not to stay where I was." She said, "That's different." I said, "Yes, it is." The knife was sharp enough. I stopped and held it and looked at the blade in the dark. She said, "I'm not asking you to stay." I said, "I know." She said, "I know I'm not in a position to. I have the land and I have this, and I don't have anything to offer a man except hard years." I said, "Mrs. Drum." She said, "Nora." I said, "Nora, you haven't offered me anything. I'm here because I'm here. I fixed the roof because the roof needed fixing. I turned the south field because the field needed turning." She said, "And?" I thought about that. I said, "And I'd like to see if the wheat comes in." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood of one. She looked out at the desert and I looked at the knife, and after a while she said, "I think you're going to be here a while, deek-collared." I said, "I think you might be right." We sat on the step until the cold came in enough that she went inside, and I sat a few minutes more in the dark and thought about all the miles behind me, and the particular feeling of a man who has stopped moving and realized he has stopped because he is, for the first time in a long time, somewhere he wants to be. Foss made his actual move in November. I want to be fair to him here, which is a strange thing to say about a man I believe killed a woman's husband, but there it is. He waited 33 days from the day I outbid him in that yard. That is either patience or planning, and in Foss's case it was both. He came himself this time. He came with Birch and the wide man and another man I hadn't seen before, a younger fellow, neat, who I pegged as a lawyer before he opened his mouth. They came in the morning when the light was still low, and I was at the well. Foss said, "Good morning, Collard." I said, "Foss." He said he had come with an offer for Mrs. Drum, and he would like to present it to her directly. I said, "She's inside. Knock on the door and she'll answer or she won't." He looked at me a moment. He said, "You're not her husband." I said, "No." He said, "You're not her family." I said, "No." He said, "You have no legal standing on this property." I said, "I'm a man standing in a yard. That's the standing I need this morning." That hung in the cold air for a moment. Then Foss walked to the door and knocked, and Nora answered, which I had expected. She was not a woman who hid. She stood in the doorway with a shawl around her shoulders, and she looked at Foss, and she looked at the lawyer, and she did not look at me, which meant she was deciding this herself, which was what I wanted. Foss spoke. He made his offer. It was a cash number for the land. I didn't hear the amount, but I watched Nora's face, which was steady and even and gave nothing. When Foss finished, Nora said, "I'm not selling." He said he thought she understood the difficulty of her position. She said she understood it fine. He said that a woman alone on 60 acres in this country, with winter coming, with a note that had been only partially settled with. She said, "I'm not alone." Foss stopped. She said, "And the note is settled. Mr. Pruitt accepted the payment. I have the receipt." The lawyer said something quiet to Foss. Foss listened. Then Foss said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mrs. Drum." She said, "I imagine I am." Then she looked at me, just once directly and then back at Foss. It was not a long look. It was the look a person gives when they are including you in something. She said, "Good day, Mr. Foss." And she went back inside. Foss stood at the door for a moment, then he turned and looked at me. He said, "You have no idea what you've walked into." I said, "I know exactly what I've walked into. 60 acres of good wheat ground and a woman who won't sell you what she doesn't owe you. I've been in worse." He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the field, the turned south ground with the seed in it, the winter wheat that was not yet showing but was there beneath the surface beginning. He said, "You're a long way from home, Collard." I said, "I'm right where I am." He put his hat on and walked out with his men, and I listened to them leave, their horses on the hard-packed track fading south toward town. I stood in the yard until the sound was gone. Then Nora came back out. She came and stood beside me in the yard, and we both looked at the south field in the morning light. She said, "Thank you." I said, "You handled it yourself." She said, "You were there." I said, "Yes." She said, "That matters." We stood in the yard without talking. The early cold was burning off, and the light was coming in low and flat across the turned ground, and there were sparrows working along the edge of the field where the soil was still loose. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her through the shawl and the morning air, not touching, just present. She reached over without looking at me and put her hand on my arm, just placed it there. A plain gesture, no ceremony to it, the kind that is harder to make than an elaborate one. I didn't move. I let it be what it was. She said, "I know what it cost you, in that yard." I said, "I didn't have anything better to spend it on." She squeezed once lightly, and then she let go. She went back inside to start the day. I stood a minute more in the yard. The sparrows were moving along the south edge, and behind them, where the seed was deep in the good soil, maybe, it was too early to be sure, but maybe, there were the first pale beginnings of green. Winter came slow that year and clean, without hard storms, which is not always the way in that country but was the way that year. The wheat came in. Not all of it, 3/4 of the south field, which is what you can expect the first year when you're working new-turned ground in late season, but enough to matter. Enough to put a number against the next spring's needs and have some left. Foss filed 2 papers over the winter, both through the lawyer. The first was a claim on an easement through the north side of the property, which Nora answered herself, in writing, with language I had not known she had in her, precise and legal, and Prout told me later, correct. The second was a nuisance claim about the well, which the lawyer appeared to abandon within a week, possibly because it was frivolous even by the relaxed standards of that territory. I did not approach the sheriff about Caleb Drum. The sheriff was a man named Alt who spent most of his time managing the saloon situation and had been elected by votes that Foss had either delivered or allowed, and I was not naive enough to think a stranger's theory about a man's convenient death in a ravine was going to get traction with him. What I did instead was write a letter. I sent it to a land registry office 3 counties over and another to a federal land agent in Albuquerque whose name I knew from a previous situation, setting out what I knew and what I suspected and asking for nothing except that someone knew. Whether anything comes from that, I can't tell you. It was the thing I could do that was actual, and so I did it. Foss stopped sending men in March. I don't know entirely why. Maybe the wheat coming in made the arithmetic less favorable. Maybe the letters found the right desk. Maybe he just decided a 60-acre farm with a stubborn woman and a settled-in stranger wasn't worth the ongoing cost. Men like Foss are eventually practical, which is both their flaw and their efficiency. The peach trees bloomed in April, all 6 of them, which was the first time I'd seen them in bloom. There's a thing about an orchard in bloom that I have never been able to explain to someone who hasn't seen it. The way the color sits against the pale sky, the smell of it, the sound of the bees that appear out of nowhere for it. Nora stood in the orchard in April and looked at the trees the way you look at something that is yours and has survived, and I stood near her and neither of us spoke for a long time. In May, she asked me plainly if I intended to stay. We were at the table after supper. The lamp was on. There was a book open on her side and my coffee was in front of me. She said, "I need to know, Deke, not because I'm asking you to decide right this minute. Just because I need to know if I'm thinking about this land by myself or with someone else." I said, "With someone else." She said, "All right." I said, "I mean you in case that wasn't clear." She said, "It was clear. I was asking about you." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She went back to her book. I finished my coffee. That was all. That was everything. We married in June. The preacher was an itinerant from 2 towns over, a small, round man named Deacon Fry who smelled of eucalyptus and spoke the words with enough conviction that they meant what they were supposed to mean. Nora wore her good dress, which was not the brown cotton but a deep blue wool that was warm for June but that she wore anyway, and she stood next to me in front of Deacon Fry and held my hand, and the way she held it, steady, deliberate, without performance, was the thing I carried forward from that day. Prout was there. Aldous the Smith came, which surprised me. 2 women from the edge of town, the ones who had been present at the yard and who had stood at a distance and had never quite approved but had never quite left either. They came and brought preserved fruit, and stood at the back of the room with the careful faces of people who are glad something has worked out even if they didn't expect it to. Foss was not there, which was appropriate. We ate outside under the ramada afterward in the evening, with the desert cooling and the peach trees in full summer leaf. Deacon Fry told a story about a wedding in New Mexico that had involved a bear, which I don't believe he had witnessed personally, but which was entertaining. Nora sat beside me and ate, and talked to the women with the careful dignity she brought to everything, and twice, without looking at me, put her hand briefly on my knee under the table. The first time was during the bear story. The second time was when Prout made a toast that was awkward but genuinely meant. I sat in the evening under my own ramada on my own land and ate food grown in my own field, and had a woman beside me who had chosen me. Not because I had rescued her exactly, because she was not a woman who needed rescue, but because I had been present and steady and useful when it mattered. And she was a woman who valued that above other things, and she had made her choice freely and with her eyes open, and that was the thing. That was the thing. There is one more part of this I want to tell you, and it is the part I've told the least over the years because it belongs mostly to me. That night, the wedding night, after the guests had gone and the lamp was down low, and the house was the house the way it is when it is just the 2 of you, she came and sat beside me on the edge of the bed and took my hands in hers and held them for a while without saying anything. She looked at them. I have working hands, which means scarred and calloused and not pretty, and she looked at them the way a person looks at something they are glad to hold. She said, "I know what it must have seemed like, you coming in off the road and doing what you did." I said, "I came in off the road and fixed a well rope." She said, "Before the well rope." I said, "I know." She said, "I want you to know that I saw it, all of it, I saw you stand in that yard and say a number you didn't have and say it like you meant it and not flinch. I saw you every morning on this land. I saw you write those letters, which Prout told me about because he tells me things. I saw you stand in the yard when Foss came and you didn't make a show of it, you just stood there. She stopped. Then she said, "That's the kind of man I wanted when I was a young woman and thought I knew what I wanted, and it turned out I didn't know, not really. And then I was older and I thought, well, that's not the kind of man who comes along." I didn't say anything. She said, "But you did." I looked at her in the low lamplight. She was looking at my hands still, her thumbs moving across the knuckles in a slow, deliberate way. Then she looked up. She said, "I am glad you came into that yard." I said, "So am I." She put my hands together between both of hers, pressed them once hard, and then she smiled, fully, without reservation, which was not something she did often and was therefore, when it came, the most complete thing in the room. That was 11 years ago now. The South Field is in Milo this year, because the wheat was 3 years and the Milo was the right rotation. The North Field I put to pasture, which was something I'd thought about since that first walk. This land wants grass and some cattle, not all row crop, and Nora agreed when I said it out loud, and then said she'd been thinking it since before I got there, which is probably true. We have 4 horses. The peach orchard is 8 trees now. I put in 2 more the second spring. There are 3 cows, which is not many, but it is the beginning of something. The house has a second room that we built the summer after we married, adobe that I and Aldous laid together in a week in July, which is the wrong month to lay adobe, and we both knew it and did it anyway because there was no better time. Foss sold up and left the territory in the winter of the 3rd year. I don't know where he went, and I don't need to know. The land agent from Albuquerque had come through in the fall of the 2nd year and spent 2 days talking to people in Garnet Flats, and Prout had talked to him, and Birch had left for somewhere east before that visit was done. Whatever came of it, what came of it was that Foss left. Caleb Drum is buried in the hill behind the house. I put a proper stone on him in the spring of my 1st year here, cut it myself out of the flat sandstone that breaks along the flats in easy slabs. Nora's name is on it too, which she asked for, because she said she didn't want him alone out there. I put it up on a Tuesday, and she came out in the evening and stood at it for a while, and I left her to that. I am 62 years old. I have ridden approximately 12,000 miles in this life. Most of it pointed away from something, and I ended up here, on 60 acres of high desert ground that grows peaches and Milo and good winter wheat, with a woman who chose me when she did not need to choose anyone, and who tells me, in the way she has of saying things without saying them, every day that she is glad she did. I am glad, too. This morning she was in the garden when I came in from the North Field, and she looked up and said, "The tomatoes are ready. Can you get me more steaks?" I said, "Yes." She went back to the tomatoes. "I went to get the steaks." That's the whole of it. That's the whole of everything.